The mop hit the marble floor and the contact made a harsh noise in contrast to the gentleness of the morning breeze. Nobody looked up. A young man in faded gray overalls pushed a cleaning cart down the longest corridor in the palace. His head slightly bowed, his eyes watching everything. The chandeliers above him were worth more than entire villages. The men who walked past him without blinking were worth even less than the dirt he was hired to clean. And the secrets buried beneath those polished floors, those were worth everything. His name was Prince Aidan, and not a single person in that palace knew it. He had walked through the Golden Gates 3 weeks earlier carrying nothing but a worn-out bag, a fake name on a piece of paper, and a question burning so deeply inside his chest that it had kept him awake for months. The question was simple. The answer, he was beginning to understand, was anything but, where was the money going? Millions had been allocated. Schools were supposed to be built. Hospitals were supposed to be expanded. Bridges, roads, food reserves for the driest season the kingdom had seen in 40 years. The king, his father, had signed every document personally. The funds had been released. The announcements had been made. But the schools never came. The hospitals remained half-built. And in the villages beyond the palace walls, children were still walking 6 miles each morning just to reach a classroom with no roof. Someone was stealing from the people. And whoever it was, they were doing it from inside these very walls. Aidan had tried the proper channels first. He had gone to the council, presented his concerns with documents and figures. He had stood in rooms full of men in expensive robes and said, plainly, that something was wrong. They had nodded. They had smiled. They had told him he was passionate and that his concern was admirable. And then, one by one, they had done absolutely nothing. That was when he knew. The problem was not outside the palace. The problem was the palace. So he disappeared. Quietly, without announcement, without explanation. He told only one person, his most trusted aide, where he was going and why. He changed his appearance, trimmed his beard, borrowed the clothes of a common laborer. And he walked through the servants' entrance of his own home like a stranger. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. The palace had a world inside it that most people never saw. There were 2 kingdoms, really, one above and one below. Above lived the royals, the council, the ministers and their guests. People who floated through gilded rooms like they had been born weightless. Below, in the kitchens and laundry rooms and maintenance corridors, lived the people who made all of that floating possible. Aidan had been assigned to the East Wing cleaning staff under the name Daniel. His supervisor was a broad-shouldered man named Mr. Harlan, who wore a permanent scowl and spoke to the cleaning staff the way most people spoke to furniture. On Aidan's first morning, Harlan stood in front of the assembled staff of 14 people and pointed at each of them in turn. "You are here to be invisible," Harlan said. "You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not make eye contact with palace officials. You do not enter any room that is not on your assigned list. You do not ask questions. You clean. That is all you are here to do." Nobody said a word. 14 pairs of eyes stared at the floor, except one. A young woman at the far end of the line looked directly at Harlan as he spoke. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were clasped behind her back. She was listening, but she was not afraid. There was something in her face that Aidan recognized immediately, not defiance exactly, but dignity. The kind that survives even when everything around it tries to crush it flat. Her name was Miriam, and within 2 days, Aidan understood that she was the person in this building who knew everything. She had worked in the palace for 4 years. She knew which officials came in through which doors. She knew who stayed late and who left early. She knew which rooms were cleaned and which ones the staff were quietly told to skip. She had learned the rhythms of the palace the way a musician learns a complicated piece, note by note, until it was something she could read without thinking. On his 3rd day, Aidan found himself assigned to the same corridor as Miriam. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. Then she spoke without looking at him. "You don't hold a mop like someone who's held one before," she said quietly. He kept moving the mop. "It shows?" Only to someone watching, she said. He glanced at her. She was wringing out a cloth over a bucket, her back to him, completely composed. I'll get better at it, he said. That's not what concerns me, she replied. What concerns me is why someone who doesn't know how to hold a mop is here pretending that he does. Aiden said nothing for a long moment. I needed work, he finally said. Miriam turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Her eyes were sharp and careful. Everyone here needed work, she said. But most of them came in looking tired. You came in looking like you were searching for something. He held her gaze. Maybe I am. She looked at him for another beat. Then she turned back to her bucket. Be careful what you find in this place, she said softly. Some things in here were buried on purpose. The days started bleeding into each other. Aiden cleaned. He polished. He mopped corridors and restocked supply rooms and pushed carts from one end of the east wing to the other. He smiled when Harlan barked at him. He apologized when he was spoken to like something less than human. And every night, alone in the small staff dormitory he shared with 3 other workers, he lay on his cot and turned over every single thing he had seen that day. The patterns were becoming clearer. There was a room on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, room 317, that was never on the cleaning schedule. Every other room had a rotation. Room 317 did not exist on any list. But men went in and out of it. Always at night. Always the same 3 men. Chief Administrator Voss, Deputy Minister Crane, and a 3rd man Aiden had not yet been able to identify, tall, always in a dark coat, always keeping his face slightly turned away. Aiden started paying very close attention to Voss. Administrator Voss was the kind of man who had perfected the performance of virtue. He spoke at public functions about the kingdom's duty to its citizens. He chaired the committee overseeing infrastructure spending. He wore modest clothes for a man of his position and was frequently praised for his humility. Everyone who mattered seemed to trust him completely. But Aiden watched the way Voss walked through the servant corridors. The way he looked through the cleaning staff as though they were made of glass. The way he laughed, too loudly, too quickly, when he was with certain people, and then let his face go completely blank the moment he thought no one was watching. There was something deeply wrong with that man. Aiden could feel it in his bones. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Tuesday. Aiden was cleaning the corridor outside the administrative offices when he heard raised voices behind a partially open door. He slowed his cart, kept his head down, kept moving but slowly. Inside, Harlan was shouting, I told you not to take anything from that room. Harlan's voice was sharp and panicked. I told you specifically. I didn't take anything, came a woman's voice, quiet, steady. Aiden stopped just outside the door. Then explain to me, Harlan hissed. Why Deputy Minister Crane is saying that a file is missing from his office. A file that only you had access to because you cleaned in there yesterday. I cleaned the room, the woman said. I cleaned it and I left. I did not touch any files. You're calling the Deputy Minister a liar? I'm saying I did not touch any files. A pause. Then Harlan's voice dropped to something uglier. I could have you removed from this palace today. You understand that? You'd lose everything. Your wage, your housing allowance, your reference. Everything. All I have to do is say the word. Silence. Aiden looked up slowly, just enough to see through the crack of the door. Miriam was standing with her hands folded in front of her, looking at Harlan without flinching. But her jaw was trembling very slightly, not from fear, from the effort of controlling something much bigger than fear. I did not take anything, she said again. Harlan stepped closer to her. Then you'd better hope that file turns up, because if it doesn't, I will make sure everyone in this kingdom knows your name, and not in a way you'd like. He walked out. The door swung wider. Aiden was already moving before he thought about what he was doing. He stepped into the doorway. Miriam was standing completely still, her eyes closed, her hands pressing together so hard her knuckles were white. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Her eyes opened. For just a moment, something cracked in her expression. Something exhausted and frightened and very, very tired of fighting. Then she pressed it back down. I'm fine, she said. You didn't take anything, he said. It wasn't a question. Of course not. I know, he said simply. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face. How would you know? She asked. Because I've been watching, he said. And in 3 weeks, I haven't seen you take a single thing that doesn't belong to you. Not even a piece of bread from the kitchen when you thought no one was looking. She stared at him. You've been watching me? I've been watching everyone, he said carefully. It's the only way to understand a place. A long pause. Then Miriam sat down slowly on the edge of a chair, like the strength had just gone from her legs. That file, she said quietly. It wasn't missing. I saw it on his desk when I cleaned. It was right there. A thick brown folder with a red seal. Aiden was very still. What kind of red seal? She looked up at him. The kind that only gets used on documents from the royal treasury. That night, Aiden didn't sleep. He lay on his cot staring at the ceiling while the other workers breathed slowly around him. A treasury document. In Crane's office. Not filed, not stored in any official repository. Just sitting on a desk in a room that had reportedly lost a file nobody could produce. Either the file never went missing, or someone had moved it before Harlan could use Miriam as an excuse to search her. He turned it over and over until the logic settled into something cold and clear. They were hiding funds, and they were doing it carefully enough that they needed to control everyone around them, including the cleaning staff, including a woman who had simply done her job and seen something she was never meant to see. He had to get into room 317. 3 days later, he got his chance. He found a gap in the schedule, a 12-minute window on Thursday evening when the third-floor corridor would be unmonitored. He knew this because he had been paying attention to every camera position, every guard rotation, every pattern of movement in the building for 2 weeks straight. He had mapped it all in his head the way a soldier maps a battlefield. He moved quickly and quietly, down the back stairwell, up to the 3rd floor, along the corridor with his cart in front of him just in case, to the door of room 317. The lock was a standard palace model. He had prepared for this. His hands were steady. The door opened. Inside was a medium-sized room that had been turned into something between an office and a storage space. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A desk sat in the center with a lamp, a laptop, and stacks of folders arranged with unusual neatness. On the far wall, pinned to a board, was a map of the kingdom. But it wasn't just a map. There were numbers written across different regions, dates, names of contractors, lines connecting locations to figures to initials he recognized. He stepped closer. His chest tightened. The figures on that board didn't match anything he had seen in the official budget reports. The official reports showed $40 million allocated to the Northern Region Infrastructure Fund. The board showed $40 million received, and $31 million redirected to a private holding account registered under a name he didn't recognize. $9 million had trickled through to actual construction. $9 million out of 40. He moved to the next section. Southern agricultural grants. Education funding. Medical supply contracts. Every single line told the same story. The money was arriving. It was just never reaching the people it was meant for. He took out the small device his aide had smuggled to him, no larger than a button, and began photographing everything. His hands moved fast. His breathing was controlled. His mind was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. He was almost done when he heard footsteps in the corridor. If you're still watching up to now, type, "I'm still here" in the comments section. This story is just getting started. He pressed himself against the wall beside the door. His heart was hammering, but his body was completely still. The footsteps stopped directly outside the room. A voice, low, cautious. "I thought I saw a light." Another voice, and Aiden recognized it immediately. "Vas, you're imagining things," Vas said. "Come. We'll use the other entrance." The footsteps moved away. Aiden stood in the darkness of room 317 for 45 seconds without moving. Then he slipped out, relocked the door, and walked, slowly, steadily, like a man with nowhere to be, back down the corridor toward the stairwell. He made it back to the dormitory. He sat on his cot and looked at the device in his palm. Everything was on it. The next morning, Miriam found him at the supply room. She closed the door behind her and turned to face him. Her expression was different from anything he had seen on her before. There was urgency in it, and fear. "Something is happening," she said. "Harlan called a meeting last night for senior floor staff. I wasn't supposed to hear, but the door wasn't fully closed." She paused. "They're saying there's been a security breach. Someone accessed a restricted area. They don't know who yet, but they're going to start questioning every single staff member today." Aiden looked at her steadily. "How much time do we have?" She blinked. "Daniel, how much time?" "Maybe 2 hours before they start," she said. "But why are you asking it like that? Like you already know what happened?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miriam, I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay very calm when I do." She held his gaze. "My name is not Daniel," he said. She didn't move. "My name is Aiden," he said quietly. "I am the king's son." The color left her face. He watched her process it. Watched her replay every conversation they had ever had. Watched her remember every moment she had seen him clean, mop, and carry things. Watched understanding arrive in stages, like light filling a room. She started. "I came because I needed to know the truth," he said. "And now I have it. I have proof of everything. But if they question the staff and identify me, everything I've gathered becomes evidence in a case nobody will ever officially open." She stared at him. "So what do you need?" "I need to get this information out of the palace before they find me," he said. "And I need someone who knows every corridor, every exit, every blind spot in this building." A silence stretched between them, and then Miriam straightened. That quiet dignity he had noticed on his very first day rose up in her face again, clearer and stronger than ever. "Follow me," she said. What happened next took 40 minutes and felt like 40 years. Miriam moved through the palace like water, naturally, without hesitation, choosing routes that Aiden would never have found on his own. Service corridors, a laundry delivery bay, a maintenance exit behind the east kitchen that opened onto a small courtyard used only by the groundskeeping team. At the courtyard gate, Aiden stopped. "Go back," he said. "You've done enough. More than enough." She shook her head. "If they find out I helped you, it doesn't matter whether I go back or not. Harlan will make sure I'm finished either way." "Miriam, I have a brother," she said suddenly. Her voice was quiet and completely level. "He's 12 years old. He lives in the northern region. He was supposed to start secondary school this year with one of the new scholarship programs." She paused. "The program was discontinued." "No explanation." "Funds redirected. He's been home for 6 months, helping my mother carry water every morning because they still don't have a functioning well in their village." Her eyes met his. "So don't tell me to go back." Aiden looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. He contacted his aide from the courtyard. The message went through in 3 minutes. By the time the palace security had begun its staff interviews, the evidence was no longer in the building. And Aiden was already on his way to the king. What nobody tells you about confronting corruption is this: the hardest part is never the corrupt ones. They can be dealt with. Evidence is evidence. Truth is truth. Systems, however broken, still have mechanisms for correction when the right person applies enough pressure in the right place. The hardest part is the people at the top who didn't want to see it. Aiden had known his father for his entire life. He knew the king as a man who genuinely believed in justice, who had spent decades trying to build something good and lasting, who trusted the people around him because he had chosen them himself, and to doubt them would mean doubting his own judgment. The conversation lasted 4 hours. It began with Aiden walking into the king's private study, not through the official entrance, but through the back corridor that he had used as a child when he wanted to visit his father without announcement. The guard at the door had known him since birth. He stepped aside without a word. The king looked up from his desk. He stared at his son, at the faded gray overalls, the trimmed beard, the worn-out shoes, and his face moved through shock, confusion, and then something that looked very much like grief. "Aiden," he said, Father, Aiden said. We need to talk. He laid everything on the desk. Every photograph, every figure, every name. He walked his father through it slowly, from the beginning, not rushing, not editorializing. Just facts, arranged in the order in which they revealed themselves. The king sat very still throughout. When Aiden finished, the room was completely silent. The king looked down at the photographs spread across his desk. His hands, resting flat on the table, were trembling very slightly. "Vas," he said. Not a question. A sound. The sound a man makes when he realizes how completely he has been deceived. "And Crane," Aiden said. "And at least one more we haven't fully identified yet." The king closed his eyes. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Based on what I found, at least 6 years," Aiden said. "Possibly longer." 6 years. The king sat with that number. 6 years of signed documents. 6 years of confident reports. 6 years of men sitting across from him and looking him in the eyes and telling him everything was running smoothly. 6 years of children walking to schools that were never built and families drinking from wells that were never dug. When the king opened his eyes, something in them had changed. "Show me everything again," he said. "From the beginning. This is the moment you subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button right now because what happens next you do not want to miss. And smash the like button if this story has you gripped." The council session was called for the following morning. It was framed as an emergency financial review, routine enough to avoid suspicion, specific enough to require the attendance of everyone involved. Voss arrived in his usual careful clothes. Crane came in beside him, exchanging a quiet word at the door. The unidentified third man, whose name Aiden had finally confirmed from the financial records as Lord Saran, a senior member of the Infrastructure Oversight Board, took his seat at the far end of the table. None of them had any idea what was coming. Aiden was not supposed to be in that room. He was not announced. He walked in 5 minutes after the session began, still in the gray overalls, and took a position standing quietly at the far wall. Every head in the room turned. Voss looked at him with the specific confusion of a man who recognizes a face but cannot place it. Then something shifted in his expression, something fast and instinctive, and whatever blood was in his face began to leave it. The king spoke. 3 weeks ago, the king said, his voice steady and precise, I had a concern brought to my attention regarding the allocation of infrastructure and social development funds. Given the sensitivity of the matter, I authorized a private review. He paused. I would like to present the findings of that review now. The images appeared on the screen behind him. The board from room 317, photographed and enlarged. The financial trails, the holding accounts, the figures, side by side with the official reports. The room was absolutely silent. Then Voss stood up. His voice was controlled, but his hands were gripping the table edge. Your Majesty, I don't know where this information came from, but I can assure you. Sit down, Administrator Voss. The king's voice was quiet. That was what made it devastating. Voss sat down. You will have the opportunity to respond, the king said. But you will wait your turn. He continued presenting. Every figure, every discrepancy, every redirected fund, every name attached to every account. The silence in the room deepened with each slide until it had a weight and a texture of its own. When he finished, he looked at Aiden. My son conducted this investigation, the king said, at significant personal risk, and at the cost of 3 weeks of living as the people he was trying to protect. Every eye in the room moved to Aiden. Voss was breathing fast. Crane had gone the color of chalk. Lord Saran stared at the table in front of him, as though he were hoping it would open and swallow him whole. Aiden stepped forward from the wall. He did not raise his voice. He had learned in those 3 weeks that people who need to shout are people who are not sure they are being heard. He was very sure. The Northern Region Infrastructure Fund received 40 million, he said. 9 million reached the people. 31 million disappeared into private accounts. The Southern Agricultural Grant, the Education Expansion Program, the Medical Supply Initiative. He paused. Every single one. The same story, the same accounts, the same signatures. He looked at Voss. The man they gave clean corridors to, Aiden said quietly. The man they walked past without looking at. That was me. And I saw everything you did when you thought no one important was watching. Voss opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Because there was nothing, not a single word in the world, that was going to help him in that moment. The arrests were made by the end of the day. Not announced publicly, not yet. The king moved carefully, sealing records, securing accounts, ensuring that every thread was captured before any of them could be cut. Voss, Crane, and Lord Saran were escorted from the palace grounds by the royal guard in the early evening. A fourth name emerged during the initial questioning. A financial officer who had facilitated the account transfers, and he was found and detained by midnight. In the weeks that followed, independent auditors were brought in from outside the kingdom. Every fund was reviewed, every transaction traced. Where money could be recovered, it was recovered. Where it could not, restructured allocations were approved to restore what had been promised. The Northern Region Infrastructure Program was reinstated with full funding and a new oversight structure that included citizen-led monitoring committees. The scholarship program that Miriam's brother had lost his place in was reopened with expanded enrollment. He started school 6 weeks later. Miriam was formally recognized for her integrity during the investigation and offered a position within the newly created Public Accountability Office, an institution Aiden proposed to the king and helped design himself. She accepted without hesitation. On the day her appointment was announced, Aiden found her in one of the East Wing corridors, the same one where they had first worked side by side with mops and buckets and careful words. She was standing very still, looking out of one of the long windows at the city below. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Like my brother is going to be okay," she said. He nodded. They stood there together for a moment, looking at the city, at the streets and rooftops and the distant shimmer of the northern region beyond the hills. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. When you first came in," she said, "and Harlan gave that speech about being invisible, did you actually believe that was how people saw the staff?" Aiden was quiet. "No," he said finally, "but I needed to understand what it felt like to live inside that invisibility. Because a leader who has never been unseen has no real idea what he is asking his people to endure." Miriam looked at him. "Then you learned," she said. "I learned," he agreed. The king addressed the kingdom 2 months after the arrests. He did not minimize what had happened. He did not offer careful, evasive language designed to soften the scandal. He stood before the people and said what was true, that men he had trusted had betrayed both him and them, that funds meant for their lives had been stolen in the dark, that it had taken his son, working in secret alongside the people those funds were meant to serve, to bring it to light. He said something else, too. He said that for too long power had been something that moved at a distance from the people it governed. That decisions were made in rooms most people would never see, by people most citizens would never meet, about lives those same people had never actually lived. He said that was going to change. He announced the establishment of the Public Accountability Office. He announced quarterly public reviews of all major fund disbursements. He announced that Aiden would lead the new oversight structure, not from behind a desk, but in active engagement with every region of the kingdom. And then he did something that nobody expected. He said that the first recommendation he would be acting on was not a policy recommendation. It was a personal one. His son had told him during one of their long conversations in the study that the people who understood a system best were rarely the people at the top of it. They were the people who kept it running. The king looked out at the crowd. "I have spent my reign surrounded by advisors," he said. "From this point forward, I intend to be surrounded by people." There is a version of this story where Aiden storms in and announces himself and the corruption crumbles at the force of his identity, where the prince's status is the weapon. That is not the story. What Aiden discovered in those 3 weeks was not just a financial crime. It was something older and harder to name. It was the gap, the vast, deliberate, carefully maintained gap between those who governed and those who were governed. The gap that made it possible for 31 million to vanish without anyone in power noticing. because the people who would have noticed were never the people anyone listened to. Miriam had known. The workers had known. The woman in the northern region carrying water past the site of the well that was never built had known. They had known for years. They had simply never been in a room where their knowing counted for anything. Aiden changed that, not because he was a prince, but because he was, for 3 weeks, a cleaner. Because he learned to see through the eyes of the unseen. Because he understood that leadership is not the performance of power. It is the willingness to go where power is uncomfortable, to ask the questions that comfort discourages, and to really listen to the answers. He reclaimed nothing with force. He earned everything with truth. And maybe that is the lesson hiding inside this story, not just for kingdoms but for all of us. The people who change things are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They are the ones paying careful attention in the corners. They are the ones whose names are never announced but whose absence would collapse the entire structure. They are the ones who endure being unseen and keep working anyway, because the work itself matters, because people's lives depend on it. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Because sometimes the person cleaning the corridor knows exactly what is happening behind the doors. And sometimes, when everything finally comes to light, it is their truth that does the changing. Now, if this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, think something, remember something, then hit that subscribe button. Because this is exactly what we do here. We tell the stories that don't just pass the time, they shift something in you. Stories about truth and power and the people who refuse to stay invisible. Leave a comment below telling us which moment hit you hardest. Was it Miriam standing her ground in that office? The prince in the darkness of room 317?